Your car makes a sound it shouldn't make. You take it in. The mechanic gives you a number, $400. Not 4,000, not 40,000, 400. And yet, for millions of households, that number is enough to quietly rearrange the next 30 days. Which bill gets paid late? Which account gets strained? Which balance starts collecting interest? The amount is small. The aftermath isn't. So here's the real question this video is going to answer. How does a $400 problem turn into something so much bigger? It's a Tuesday morning. The check engine light comes on. Nothing dramatic. No smoke, no breakdown on the highway, just a small orange light that wasn't there yesterday. By Thursday, there's a diagnosis, a part that needs replacing. Labor included, the total comes to $400. For a lot of households, that number would barely register. Pay it, move on, forget about it by the weekend. But for a lot of other households, $400 isn't sitting in a separate account labeled emergencies. It's already spoken for. It's next week's groceries. It's part of the electric bill. It's the gap between one paycheck and the next. So the same $400 repair bill lands very differently depending on what that money was already supposed to do. And that difference, what happens to a budget the moment $400 gets pulled out of it, is where this story actually begins. Every year, the Federal Reserve asks American adults a very specific question as part of a nationwide study called the Survey of Household Economics and Decision-Making. The question is simple. If you had a sudden $400 expense, how would you pay for it? In the Federal Reserve's most recent report, covering 2025, 63% of adults said they could cover it using cash or its equivalent. That phrase matters, so it's worth slowing down on. Cash or its equivalent doesn't just mean bills in a wallet. The Fed defines it as cash, money already sitting in a checking or savings account, or a credit card that gets paid off completely at the next statement. In other words, credit used the way it's designed to be used, without carrying a balance. That leaves 37% of adults who said they would cover it a different way, by putting it on a credit card and paying it off over time, borrowing from a bank or a person, selling something, or in some cases saying they simply wouldn't be able to pay it at all. Not a guess, not a headline exaggeration, a specific answer to a specific question, asked the same way every year since 2013. And that's exactly why it's worth taking seriously. Here's the part most people miss when they hear this statistic. The $400 itself was never really the danger. The danger is what has to happen next in order to pay it. Picture a household running on a normal, functioning budget. Income comes in, rent goes out, utilities, groceries, insurance, transportation, all accounted for, all already assigned to something. Now a $400 expense shows up that wasn't on that list. If there's no buffer sitting outside the regular budget, that $400 has to come from somewhere that was already spoken for. Maybe it's pulled from what was going to cover next week's groceries. Maybe it delays the insurance payment by a few days. Maybe it goes on a credit card instead, because moving the due date is easier than finding the cash today. Whichever path it takes, something else in the budget now has less room than it had yesterday. That's the mechanism. One category loses money to cover another category's emergency. And unless more income arrives to refill it, that gap doesn't just disappear. It moves forward into the next week, and sometimes the next bill. The $400 isn't the whole event. It's the trigger for a chain reaction that plays out over the following days and weeks. Here's where the story gets bigger than one car repair. According to the same 2025 Federal Reserve survey, 59% of adults experienced at least one major unexpected expense in the previous 12 months. Not a hypothetical, something that actually happened to them. The most common one was a major vehicle repair or replacement, reported by 30% of adults. Next was a major house or appliance repair at 22%. Close behind that, unexpected major medical expenses, reported by 21%. Cars break down, water heaters fail. A trip to urgent care turns into a bill nobody planned for. None of this is rare or unusual. It's closer to a normal part of owning a car, a home, or a body. And when the Fed asked people how much these expenses actually cost, the typical answer, the median, among people who knew the amount, fell between $1,000 and $1,999. That number matters because it reframes the $400 question entirely. The Fed's hypothetical asks about a relatively small, almost modest emergency, but real unexpected expenses, on average, run 2 to 5 times higher than that. which means the $400 test isn't measuring an extreme scenario. If anything, it's measuring one of the more forgiving versions of what households actually deal with. So here's a distinction that changes how this entire statistic should be read. The real question was never, can you technically find $400 somewhere? For most people, in some form, the answer to that is yes. Sell something, put it on a card, ask a relative. The real question is, can you spend $400 without disrupting everything else that money was supposed to do? And the Fed's own research backs this up in an interesting way. In the same survey, 69% of adults said they could cover an expense of $500 or more using only their current savings, a noticeably larger share than the 60% who said they pay a $400 expense with cash or its equivalent. Read that carefully. More people say they could pay with cash than actually say they would, which tells us something important. Some of the people in that 37% aren't broke. They have money, but they're choosing not to spend it on this particular expense because that cash is being
protected as a buffer for something else. Next month's rent, an existing obligation, or simply the discomfort of watching a savings balance shrink. In other words, the $400 answer isn't only a measure of who has money. It's also a measure of how thin people feel their buffer already is. When cash isn't the option, or isn't the preferred option, the $400 has to go somewhere else. A credit card balance, a loan, borrowing from a friend or family member, selling something, delaying a different bill. None of these choices are automatically bad. Credit cards, used well, are one of the most flexible tools a household has. That's exactly why the Fed counts a card paid off in full as cash equivalent. The complication starts when the expense doesn't get paid off at the next statement, when it becomes a balance that carries forward. That's the moment a temporary emergency turns into something structurally different. Emergency plus interest, sitting on top of reduced room in next month's budget. The $400 repair is technically resolved, but the minimum payment on that balance is now a new, recurring claim on income that didn't exist a month ago. And this compounds if another unexpected expense shows up before the first one is paid off, which, given that 59% of adults reported at least one major unexpected expense in a year, isn't an unlikely scenario. Interest accumulates, available credit shrinks. The next emergency has less room to be absorbed than the one before it. This is the actual mechanism behind the phrase financial fragility. It's rarely one dramatic expense that breaks a budget. It's a small one, followed by less room to handle the next. There's a second, related number from the same Fed report that fills in the rest of this picture. 55% of adults said they had savings set aside to cover 3 months of expenses if they lost their main source of income. That figure has stayed essentially flat since 2024, and it's down from a high of 59% in
2021. This isn't the $400 question. It's a bigger one, about deeper resilience, not a single unexpected bill, but it points to the same underlying idea. A financial buffer isn't really about being cautious or frugal for its own sake. It functions as options. With a buffer, a $400 repair is an inconvenience. Money moves from savings to the repair, and the rest of the budget continues exactly as planned. Without one, that same $400 repair forces a decision. Which bill gets delayed? What goes on a card? Who gets asked for a loan? The expense hasn't changed. What's changed is how many ways there are to absorb it. This is the part that doesn't get captured by a single dramatic number. It's not that a household without a buffer is doing something wrong. It's that they are operating with fewer options the moment something goes wrong. Zoom out, and the $400 question stops being about $400 at all. A household can have a steady income, a bank account, a full-time job, and a completely reasonable set of monthly bills, and still be vulnerable to a single unexpected expense. That's not a contradiction. It's how cash flow actually works. Income arrives on a schedule. Fixed expenses, rent, insurance, a car payment, are due on a schedule too, usually one that doesn't move. Between those two schedules, there's often very little slack. Add an emergency that shows up outside both schedules, and something has to give, regardless of how responsibly the rest of the budget was built. This is why the Fed's own data shows income level isn't the only variable that matters here. Education, age, and existing savings all shape the outcome, but so does something simpler: how much room a person built into their budget before the emergency ever happened. This isn't a story about people spending irresponsibly. It's a story about timing, obligations, and buffers interacting in ways that can turn a $400 event into a multi-week financial adjustment for households that, on paper.
So, go back to that Tuesday morning. The check engine light, the $400 bill. By itself, it's nothing. A repair, a payment, a receipt. But depending on what that $400 was already supposed to do, which bill it was quietly borrowed from, whether it went on a card that carries a balance, whether it delayed something else down the line, that same $400 can turn into weeks of rearranged decisions. That's the actual finding hiding inside the Federal Reserve's data. Not that people are careless, not that $400 is some impossible mountain, but that the size of an emergency and the size of its consequences are two completely different things. The real problem was never the $400 bill. It's what that $400 forces you to do next. If you want more data-driven breakdowns of the money pressure shaping American households,